So thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited to talk to ISQOLS. I did do some work with ISQOLS in the mid-2000s, I guess, when I was at the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. So it's nice to be back. So I just thought maybe today I would reflect a little on 20 years experience now of trying to persuade people to go beyond GDP, to think more about quality of life in all of its forms, and whether you call that human development or sustainable development or subjective well-being or quality of life, it's all, for me, the same thing. It's all about thinking more broadly about the things that really matter to people's lives. So there's been 85 years really of people talking about the need to go beyond GDP, as I think most of you would know. These conversations are as old as GDP itself. You know, Simon Kuznets, the Nobel Prize-winning economist who actually invented GDP, when he introduced it to the US Congress in the mid-1930s, he could see what was coming. He said, please don't start using this as a measure of well-being. It's not that. It's a measure of how busy we are, how much money is changing hands. But of course, by the late 60s, people like Bobby Kennedy were making impassioned speeches about the perils of blindly following the compass point of GDP, because it doesn't really tell us very much about the things that matter. You know, as he said, everything except that which makes life worthwhile. At the same time, there was a social indicators movement that was springing up, really talking about quality of life and how to measure that. In the development community, there were lots of conversations in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s about what is development? How do we understand if countries are developing? It's not just about economic growth. The Human Development Index, where I work now, that came out in 1990, very much as an answer to that, saying, let's challenge GDP with one number that measures development. It's not a perfect number, but it's less imperfect than GDP. And then another seminal moment was the Stiglitz-Sen-Fatoussi report in 2009, looking at how to measure economic progress and social well-being. So all of these things have been happening. They've been making an impact. But why are we still talking about GDP so much? So some of the reasons I've heard over the years, and first reason is I know the limitations of GDP. This will often come from economists. Some of my best friends want to go beyond GDP, but GDP correlates with everything that's important. You know, why we don't need to measure other things, because even though we know the imperfections of GDP conceptually, it's just the case that when GDP goes up, health gets better, education gets better, countries can afford to start protecting their environment, and so on. Except that just isn't true. And I think a lot of people now do get that. And this is a really powerful graph from the Human Development Report, I think the 2009 report, which when this came out, when I wasn't at the UN, then I was at the OECD, which is a fairly conservative, economic think tank, a lot of economists there. And this really got people thinking, and it jaws dropped. And there are two graphs there. The red graph is looking at the correlation between growth in the Human Development Index and economic growth. And there's a very strong correlation there. And that's basically saying, as the economy grows, then human development, which is a measure of income, health, and education, also goes up. So it's that was good evidence for those who say GDP, we don't need to go beyond GDP because it tells us what's happening anyway. Except when you begin to think about the Human Development Index, you quickly realize that income is in the Human Development Index. So by sort of mathematical necessity, there will be a strong correlation because you've got income on both sides of that correlation. So take out income and just look at growth in health and education, the progress in health and education in the country, and look at the correlation of that with income growth, and there is no statistical correlation whatsoever. There's just nothing. So that's very interesting. It's saying not only does income not necessarily lead to progress in other things of development, but it shows there are other ways that countries can do this. It's no longer the case that you just tell a country to grow its economy and everything else will be fine. It doesn't work like that. There are other ways to do that, and that's a really powerful piece of evidence to that argument. Second, you'll often hear when you talk to policymakers or statisticians, I'd love to go beyond GDP. I'd love to start measuring quality of life, but I can't because there's no political demand. I can't do this without politicians wanting me to. And yet, when you see a graph like this from a few years ago, which looks at the the movements in well-being and subjective well-being, and that the axis on the left-hand side, the the 30%, is the proportion of people who report they're thriving in Egypt, which is very, very happy, essentially. You look at that over time, and you look at GDP, and the changes, and what you can see there, especially as you're a politician, is a big red flag in 2008, around about the time of the Arab Spring. Because although if you were just looking at GDP, you'd see a steady rise and everything seems okay. If you look at how people report their feeling, there's this massive decline, almost halves over the course of a year. So that would ring alarm bells for any politician who wants to keep their seat at the next election. So I think politicians do actually get this. They care about this because it means votes, and it means whether they'll be re-elected. So I disagree that there's political demand. I just don't think politicians are offered the option sometimes. The next thing is, politicians might say, or policymakers, or statisticians again, my hands are tied, there's no public demand. People don't really care about this is data. People just care about income, and that's what matters. And, we can start measuring this stuff. No one cares, we'll be laughed at. And again, that's not true. I mean, this argument gets stronger and stronger every year, it seems, with all the articles. It seems not a week goes past without something about happiness, or policymakers won't use this stuff because there's no public demand. And yet, not a week goes past without a story in the press about happiness, about well-being, about the problems of GDP. So I think people really do get this stuff on an individual level. I mean, they think GDP is important because they hear about it so much in the news. But if you actually sort of talk and look at how they react to stories like this, they really get very interested in happiness. And I think people do get this. It's too political for statisticians. This is something that especially government statisticians will say very often, in that they like to think of themselves as objective, neutral. They don't get involved in the grubby business of politics. They just simply report on the state of the world. And yet statistics are extremely political. And I think for me, this was the most important sort of finding of the Stiglitz and Fitoussi report in 2009, when Joe Stiglitz, was saying we need to measure the things that matter, which, okay, we all know that. But he sort of flipped it on its head, saying the things we choose to measure are the things that we choose to focus on, which is slightly different. So it's not just statisticians picking the right measures because they're told what matters. It's also statisticians recognizing that the things they measure are the things society starts to value because they're being measured. And that is extremely political. And that's fine. But I think statisticians, national statistical officers in particular, need to embrace that and recognize that and say, look, we've got a real duty to society to start measuring the things that really matter to the nation or the region or the world. Because if we don't put those measures out, people won't be paying attention to these. And there's, someone has to take those decisions, and statisticians, I think, are well qualified to do that and do it fairly. But I think they need to recognize that. The new measures aren't meaningful or useful. That's something else people will say, particularly about happiness. There's an argument, well, all very well, the press loves it, but what's it really telling us? And I think it's telling us a lot. Obviously, I believe that. I think everyone here would think these measures are meaningful and useful. And Laura mentioned the work I did for the World Happiness Report. And I was looking at the links between subjective well-being, life satisfaction, and the Human Development Index. And it shows two things reassuringly. It shows that there's a very strong link. This is countries in the world. And the countries with the lowest human development, the poorer, the least developed countries typically, they've also got the least happiness. So there's a strong link. Development and happiness go hand in hand, which is what we'd hope. But even more reassuring is it's not always like that. There are some countries there which are outliers off that diagonal. Countries which have low happiness but fairly high development, and countries which have high happiness given a fairly low level of development. So, there are some secrets here. Some countries they're producing a lot of happiness in their people, even though the people might not, on paper have a right to be happy. So what's the secret? What are they doing well there? Vice versa, countries which ought to be happy because they've got a high level of development people are fairly miserable. They're not very satisfied. So again, what's happening? What's gone wrong? These are very interesting questions, I think, really for the development community to start thinking about. So 5 things to do better. These are some of the arguments we've heard. How can we, given I think there's answers to a lot of these arguments, what do we need to do as a community to go beyond GDP? I think, fundamental to a lot of this stuff, I think, as a statistician, is communication. And I can say this, I think, as a statistician, that we're famously not very good communicators. I was never taught anything about communication when I studied statistics. It was all makeshift algebra. And so we really need to get better at understanding it's not just a question of putting our numbers out there and hoping people will use them, but we have a duty to get people to use them. In a perfect world, I think statisticians like me tend to think the audience we talk to are like seals at a zoo. We throw them the numbers and they're really happy, gobbling up that information. It makes them feel better. But of course, it isn't like that for most people. The vast majority of people, statistics are either super boring, not relevant, or just too difficult. They don't get it. They just switch off when they see numbers. Hans Rosling, the late Hans Rosling, a master statistical communicator, talked about the incredible journey data takes, the thousands or millions of miles or kilometers data travels from the time when a statistical organization will design a questionnaire and send that questionnaire out into the field, into every village and town in a country, and then that data gets sent back through different pathways to the computers at the statistical office, who then spend time cleaning and compiling that data and analyzing it and putting it into publications or on the internet, which in turn gets sent out. And then it reaches people's eyes, the very, very last step of the journey. And he said it was that last 2 centimeters of the trip between the eyeball and the brain that was the most important. And after those millions of miles, it's so often the case, I think all of us know, having read some statistics or some analysis, that we can look at it and it can go in front of our eyes, but it doesn't get any further. I defy people to read certain work and tell me 5 minutes later what it was saying, because it just isn't like that. Because we're so busy and we're so used to information portrayed in an easy to understand way. And Herbert Simon, who was another Nobel Prize-winning economist, had a really great quote about this many years ago, who talked about being bombarded by information. And this was in 1971. So you can imagine what he would say now about how much information we were exposed to every day. But he's basically saying, when you have a surplus of anything, it creates a deficit of something else. And when we have a surplus of attention, a surplus of information, it creates a deficit of attention. So statisticians, all of us who are presenting this data and working with it, really need, I think, to ensure we do everything we can to get it used and communicated well. We've got to present data that people want to read. They want to open that link. They want to open the publication. That they're going to understand what they see when they read it, and they're going to remember that 5 minutes, 10 minutes, preferably the next day, because then they can actually use it, and it will influence the decisions they take. There are lots of problems with data. This is just some things I've been thinking about, but it's got to be accurate. Obviously, it's great presenting data that's fabulously interesting, but if it's untrue, that's no good. So they really poor things like a pie chart here from a government with 76%, and it's clearly much less than 76% in that. It's got to be meaningful as well. It's got to make sense. This is a joke sign from somewhere called Nukayama, which looks at the population demographics and the height and so on, and just adds them up into a total. So, well, great, but that's obviously not telling us anything. It's got to tell a simple story, and I think this gets really important. There's a graph here from some company, private sector organization, I think, or the government, but it's just, look at that and what does it really tell us? There are 5 sets of questions. There are ways to order that and present it where you actually understand what it's saying, but it doesn't tell me very much when I look at it without spending several minutes. It mustn't mislead, and government is often a master of this. This is from my own country, from New South Wales in Australia, looking at the number of nurses that are being recruited. And look at that. It seems enormous progress there, from nurses going up from, I can't read that, it's from 63,000 to 66,000. But of course, if they looked at that from looking at 0, we're picking the the X to the right place, you'd see a very tiny increase. So that's just downright misleading. And it's got to be easy to interpret. So here's some graphs from the UK looking at child poverty and some school performance. And I mean, it's very, very hard for me to understand. So, you know, these are some of the reasons I think the quality of life statistics aren't being used like they should. It's because the people who produce them just often let everyone down because we don't present them clearly enough. So these five things to go better. I'll close with these, I think. First, I'm relating all these to movies. First of all is go beyond the field of dreams. I think there is this idea often as people who we put out these publications or this research, if we build it, they will come. We'll just put the data out there and people are going to rush over and use it. And of course, it doesn't work like that, often for the reasons I've said. Second, when I first got involved in this, I was working in a national statistical office in Australia. And Australia is a really friendly country. People there are pretty trusting, but there was so much mistrust between the people, the government statisticians I was working with, and people in the policy departments. You know, the statisticians almost thought, it seemed, that just by going into a room with policymakers, they might be tainted because they were so political. And policymakers also, I think they looked at statisticians as naive and slow and hopeless, and they didn't get the realities of working for a minister. So a lot of mistrust here. And you know, I've working in Australia, just bringing the two groups together and having a conversation. We very quickly found out that, well, hang on, amazingly, policymakers actually do want to make the world a better place, and they want data to do that. And it's really important to them they have the right information. And statisticians were often incredulous at this fact, whereas policymakers could begin to understand as well by these conversations. It's not so easy as just producing the number the minister wants overnight. It takes months or a year to design a solid survey. And so those conversations have led me to run role plays around the world where I bring the groups together and get them to simulate a meeting, but each of them playing the role of the other. So the statisticians become policymakers and vice versa, and it creates a lot of laughter, and people, you know, they can ham up the acting and make it quite ridiculous, but I think they do leave understanding a little bit more what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. As I said before, talking about what Joe Stiglitz was saying, recognizing that statistics are political, and that statisticians, you know, we could describe them as the reluctant revolutionaries of today. They are, through the work on measuring quality of life and challenging GDP, are really looking at changing the world. But most statisticians are not and never want to be revolutionary. So how can we empower the people who produce our data to really say, hang on, you know, you have a role here, it's political, and it could be revolutionary. Investigating impact, this relates a lot to what I do here at the UN, but I think, you know, I've seen very little evidence of the impact of what publications or research on quality of life has done. It's extremely difficult to measure this. I accept it's really hard to put out a report or a data set and actually draw concrete conclusions about the impact it's had. But I think as a community, we've got to get smarter at doing this to really demonstrate to, you know, whoever's paying for this, be it government, be it foundations, be it the public, that, you know, this really has an impact, and trying to understand how looking beyond GDP, how producing quality of life statistics is leading to better decisions and better lives for people. And I think also, and this is quite powerful often when you talk to policymakers and politicians, is the importance of the process. For me, it's really never been about the data and about the publication. I mean, that's obviously can be important, but the network that's created as a result. I've seen this time and time again, heard about it time and time again, by bringing together statisticians and policy people to talk about the indicators, how do we measure them, which indicators do we select, why are these important to quality of life, how do we talk about them, and then to bring in the public, civil society, academics, the media, to have these broad conversations across a community can be extremely powerful in many ways, and not just about the publication. It will create new networks of people. It will build capacity. It will give an audience or a different understanding to parts of the government. It will encourage cross-government, whole-of-government thinking. And the list goes on. There are many, many reasons why this can be valuable, even if the data never sees the light of day. I'll close there. There's just a quote I like here from Eric Hoffer, and it's talking about this idea of revolution. And the revolution is happening, I think, and it's been happening for a while, but it's not, the change that we are all producing every day in working with quality of life statistics, that is really preparing the ground for a revolution that I think is long overdue, and really thinking very differently about what progress means if we're to have a planet that survives, into the future, and that is fairer and happier. So that's all from me. I'm happy to have questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for that presentation. It was excellent. At this time, we have 10 participants with us and would like to ask if anyone has any questions. You can either unmute yourself or just simply take your cursor down to that bottom toolbar. There's a chat button there, and we'll be happy to read that on your behalf. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know at this time.
I'll go ahead and start while people are figuring out how to unmute themselves. It's nice when you unmute yourself to ask a question, I'd say. So yeah. You talked earlier, John, you talked about the graph with the Human Development Index and satisfaction with life, and you said, well, what's the secret, like where for these outliers? And I'm curious what your conjecture would be, and perhaps some directions of study in terms of those countries that, what did you say, they don't have, on paper, they don't have the right to be happy. What would your conjecture be there for studies?
I think this is, it's not that they don't have the right, if I did say that, I'm sorry, I didn't quite mean it.
That's okay.
What I mean is, other things equal, they ought not to be as happy as we are in the US, for example, if you look at their levels of health and education and income, but something else is going on and they are happy. I mean, there's a well-known Latin effect. So Latin America often scores very highly in happiness surveys, and happier than they do for countries at a comparable level of development. So what's going on there? I mean, if you've traveled to Latin America, you probably agree with me, it is often a very happy place. And there's a lot of, people spend a lot of time with friends and family. I think that's key to a lot of this is, maybe they work a little less and they spend more time with the people they care about. And that's one thing, but many of the work that Jon Hall has done in the World Happiness Report every day, looking at the factors that influence happiness, that I think rings very true for me. It's an absence of corruption. It is income, but it is time with people. These are some of the things I think really matter. And the corollary is that there are countries that often that some countries score quite low on life satisfaction, although they're fairly well developed, and other countries of that level of development are more satisfied. And some of those countries, at least, are from the former Soviet Union. And one theory is that communism has destroyed trust in those societies. It will take a long time to build it up. And there's a lot of trust in Latin America, I think, often when you're there, and much less in some of those former Soviet countries.
Beautiful. So other questions from people? Thank you, John.
Hello, I'm Paul Allen. Can I ask a question?
Can I jump in?
So I think, Paul, you were going to ask a question, or Annette,
Okay.
did you want to? Yeah, Paul?
Sorry, I'm just getting used to the technology. Okay, sorry, I can't set the video, sorry. So I'm Paul Allen. I'm calling you from the UK. I'd like to thank John very much for his presentation. He covered a lot of really important ground in terms of the issues and the presentation of statistics. I have two questions, John. The first is, you talked quite a bit about happiness as being, in a sense, going beyond GDP, but certainly the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report put up a whole range of different issues that we should look at. So you touched on the environment, but that's just one of the panoply of things that people are looking at when they're going beyond GDP. So the question around that is that making it too complicated? Should we just be taking one step at a time? Should we look beyond GDP to another broader measure? Let's call it happiness or general well-being. So that's kind of the first thing I'd welcome your thoughts on. Is it making it too complicated to go into detail beyond GDP? But then the second one would be, you talked about interestingly, you mentioned a couple of times the duty on statisticians to go to look at, for example, to meet all the needs for statistics. Well, that's there in the United Nations fundamental principles for official statistics. And yet whenever I kind of mention that to people, they kind of get a bit embarrassed and say, well, that's just kind of the United Nations fundamental principles. You know, in the real world of producing official statistics, we can't really sign up to that because we've got lots of other things or we haven't got enough resources. So how do we get that message across that actually there is a real duty here on national statistics offices? You know, without fear or favor, they should be published, in my view, they should be publishing statistics which go beyond GDP as widely as they publish the GDP figures. I don't know what you think about that.
Thanks, Paul. Nice to hear from you. Yeah, I mean, two interesting questions. I mean, Stiglitz and Fitoussi, they did consider looking at single indicators. I think they sort of said, it's a bit of a mess out there. We're not going to add to that mess. And they were very much on the side of sets of indicators that had both objective and subjective. And I think that's extremely important to take informed decision making. But as you say, it's really complicated for people. And one of the, and I believe this more and more, the single indicator approach is the way to really get beyond GDP. The Human Development Index, when we put it out every year at the UN, and that's a one number, it's just 3 things added together on average, super crude, far from perfect, but it really gets people talking. And, you know, prime ministers are on the phone from countries saying, why has our country gone down? We want to know what's going on. And they take action, and because it gets in news, because it's easy for people to see if they're getting better or getting worse, whatever that means. I think happiness is in some ways the perfect single number, because first of all, people get it. They understand sort of instinctively what it means. Any user sort of, we all know what happiness means, sort of, at least more than we know what GDP means. I think we can recognize that. But second, everything that's important correlates or influences happiness to a different extent. So if we can get people talking about happiness as they talk about GDP, then it does open this window into the world of every quality of life statistic, an environmental statistic you can think of. And I imagine a world in which the happiness number comes out every month and people start saying, look, there's been a spike. Older people in the northeast of England are happier this month. What's going on? Is it because there's been a pension increase or whatever? But women in the southwest are fed up. What's happened? And then the people would start looking at the health, education, income, all the other things that matter. And it would, I think, trigger a richer conversation. So I think happiness might be the best shot we have at doing that. Because as you say, sets of indicators are fantastic, but really complicated for most people to get excited about or to really make a judgment on, is life getting better, which is what this is about, I think, ultimately. Your other question, I mean, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer. When I was at the OECD, working with Enrico Giuvini, that's really what we were trying to do for 5 years, is fire statisticians up about this. And I think, you know, it went from an idea that at the time was seen as really quite risky when I did this in Australia, to a thing that a number of officers have embraced and got behind. But statisticians, you know, they do have a duty, and I think that we can keep saying this and we can try to empower them to understand how important this is, but always they're going to be very sensitive to the authorizing environment in which they work, and of course to politicians and the media. So maybe, you know, one way is to encourage the media to get stuck into governments or statistical offices that aren't doing this well, saying, you know, in other countries, statisticians are doing this, why aren't they doing it in this country? And that might empower them. But I wish I knew the answer. If we could do that, I think we'd really be several steps further down the road.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for that.
Anat, did you want to say something?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, John. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Cool. Thank you for a very interesting presentation, and I love this journey and how far it's gone. And I'd like to follow up on the previous question regarding the happiness notion. Mm-hmm. I'm just wondering whether we're not replacing the notion of GDP with the notion of happiness, both and referring to happiness just as life satisfaction, whereas we all know it is composed of the three components. It's both the experience, the life satisfaction, and the purpose. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're taking this one very complex, flawed notion of GDP and replacing it. Remember, it should be the composition of the three if we want to use it as a proper replacement. And I'm wondering between the three aspects of happiness and elements of well-being, and whether if we find ourselves with this as a leading indicator for public policy, will we do better than using the GDP? Are we not simplifying things way too much?
Yeah, thanks. And you're breaking up a little bit there, but I think I got the gist of it, I hope. Yeah, I mean, there is definitely a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and, you know, replacing GDP with another single number and blindly following that. I mean, I do think if we were to just follow happiness as we follow GDP at the moment, we'd be in better shape than we are by following GDP. But I think absolutely it's not about having one number and just getting everything geared around that. But I think it would give us a much broader, far more things go into happiness than into GDP. And so I think you're, as a one number now, however we define happiness, talk about that in a second, it would trigger that richer conversation. But it's very important to guard against, you know, governments just sort of focusing on whether the number's gone up on the whole for the country to sort of claim that they've been successful. But I think if it starts going down for certain groups, that should flag alarm bells, which would then trigger work and responses and so on. Yes, there are different kinds of happiness. Sorry.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, there are obviously different kinds and they tell us different things. It's important to publish all the measures. I like life satisfaction for the reasons that, you know, Jon Hall will explain in the World Happiness Report. It's a lot more stable over time. You know, people's sort of, mood will change at the weekend, but their life satisfaction won't very much. So it's a better measure, I think, to compare changes over time and with countries. But I think yes, it is important to measure all three. I probably wouldn't put them as a composite. I'd be maybe looking at all three of them, but focusing on life satisfaction perhaps as the headline. But there's maybe different countries or different regions that will suit them differently to do that. I don't know if that answers your question, Annette.
Thank you.
There's a question from Louis Gallardo. Is there a current index measurement system that could be the base for a Beyond GDP common set of indicators index? Well, I mean, life satisfaction would be the basis, and then but I think there are many, you know, you could justify almost anything then going into that. But if you have that as your headline flag for a particular country and saying life satisfaction is this and breaking it down, and then you pick your set of quality of life statistics that span the economic, the environmental, the societal, the political, or however you want to dish up the world, I think that could be quite powerful. There are the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN, as some of you know, is put out, and a lot of the world's activity, especially in the development community, is around those. But all of those are sort of really quality of life, if you think about them. And they could be the underlying thing we talk about when we try and understand why happiness is changing for a country.
Hey, John. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It's the other Anat.
Ah, hello.
Yeah, as a statistician, what is the probability that out of 10 people, 2 will be Anat, right? I have a question about the next level, about the intervention level. From what I read, let's say, of the things Richard Blair does about intervention, and from, if we take what Helliwell does about the society as a whole, let's say trust issues, I'm not sure where the intervention steps are going. Are they going to go to the individual level in order to cure social issues, or are they going to go into social issues and try to solve them? Because right now, I think it's not really clear.
Right. Interestingly enough, I just received in the mail yesterday the Global Happiness Policy Report that I haven't actually looked at yet. But that does talk a lot, when I worked on the draft, it talks a lot about this stuff, and it looks at the ways in which policy can help. And it's certainly not about, about empowering individuals, but there are lots of things governments are doing and thinking about that can help with this in different ways. I mean, just creating more parkland in the city could be great for happiness. It gets people out, it gets them meeting people, encouraging volunteering. When people volunteer, it raises their happiness level. So governments that sort of recognize this and start designing opportunities for people to meet their neighbors and get together, that can be powerful. I mean, I think when we start thinking about the links between happiness and health, which I know are somewhat controversial, but I think it's fairly clear that there are links in both directions. What does that mean for a government's health budget? Should they be, it might be more cost effective instead of building that new cancer hospital, putting the money into more community centers, getting people to exercise more, because these things lead to happiness as well as health. So there are lots of questions. I would really recommend people take a look at this if they're interested. This Global Happiness Report 2018. It's from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. If you Google it, you should be able to find it on their site. But it has a lot of stuff in there about, there's a whole chapter on positive education, which is the work that Seligman is doing, with schools around the world that are focusing now on building not just educated young people with knowledge in their heads, but people who've got resilient with the ways to handle, to manage their own well-being, and to guard against mental health issues down the road and so on. These are all incredibly important.
But do you think that governments are going to change also the issues that pertain to the government and not only to the individuals? Like if there's a corruption issue and that's one of the reasons that people are unhappy, would the government take that into account and change some things in the culture or in the way it operates, or is it going to go back to empowering the individual and leaving the government without real responsibility?
I mean, if the government's corrupt, then how are you going to change that? I think if this data's out there and that it gets talked about more, that's going to increase pressure, right? So if people are unhappy and the numbers come out and the government says what's going on, and people say, well, it's because of, one thing we found, there's a lot of corruption in the police, and that's making people really miserable. Maybe then government will get more serious about doing something, because it puts a spotlight on this. And as has been said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I think it will help, but I really don't, it's case by case. It can't do any harm, surely. And it isn't about saying this is all the individual's responsibility. It's about looking at the big things in life. The government can always have some influence on, and what can they do to make things better?